This is Congress for the week of April 5th through 9th, which was last week. But like wines, I suppose that things get better if they age a bit. I'm discussing specifically chapters 6 and 7 in the Davidson, Olizik, Lee, and Schickler text, and also the Melbourne article on congressional staff. And then this coming week, well, let me just say where we are in the course. The first half of the course, in addition to looking at the antecedents and the development of Congress, our main concentration following the framework which Davidson and Olizik introduced, and which I think is a useful framework of the two Congresses. The core functions of Congress as performing the function of representation and then legislation. Up till the midterm in the first half of the course, then we've examined the structures, processes, experiences that generate the representational link, however solid or attenuated one considers that to be. And so with this material, and for the rest of the course, well, I should say for the next couple of weeks, we'll be examining then the other structure, the other function of Congress, its legislative functioning. And in the same way that with the representational function we started with structures, processes, etc., we'll be doing the same thing. And indeed, if you're looking at the slightly revised schedule that I sent out, this is what we'll be doing really for the next 3 weeks. And that is chapter 6 in the Davidson and Olizik, the DOLS text, looks at the party structure, and I'm going to talk a little about the history of parties and the functions they play. And chapter 7 is the committee system and some aspects of staff, although they did very briefly discuss, if you remember from chapter 5, that's where they talked about some of the personal and committee staff in Congress. And then Malbin's article raises some very interesting and not troubling, that's a little too intense, but some very interesting questions about what the meaning, what the development of staff in Congress. Now, by the way, as you'll see when we come back to Melbourne in a little bit, this article is from the mid-90s and essentially reports on Congress up till that point. And the only reason I still use this article is because actually its core questions and observations are still valid. There are a couple of aspects of Congress's staff situation that are different now, and I'll go over those when we talk about the Melbourne piece. But again, and by the way, he wrote an entire book on this a couple of years after this article appeared, entitled Unelected Representatives. And as you're going to see, he raises a question which he also, to some degree, answers within this essay and within his larger research, and I'll talk about that when we come to that. So the two primary internal structures of Congress that shape and determine its internal legislative function are parties. And as you're going to see, parties aren't just the partisan dimension of politics, but they're also, as you're going to see, the chapter 6 is about parties and leadership, because indeed there is a constitutional structure of leadership for both houses, although the two parties and the parties essentially shape that function. So these two structures, parties and leadership on the one hand, and the committee system, are the primary structures that determine the legislative functioning of Congress. And by the way, you'll see that that's for better and worse, better or worse, better and worse. There are both solid benefits derived from the way parties and committees operate in Congress, but there are also some limitations too. And part of those are connected with the developments in staff that Melbourne talks about. And then in the same way that we looked at the structures of representation, like the district and different constituencies, and some of the historical aspects of representation, and then we kind of looked at the procedures of representation, like campaigning and how representatives relate to their districts. We'll see that in chapters 8 and 9, we kind of turn from structures to procedures. Chapter 8 has to do with the rules. I have to say, when you're generally teaching undergraduates, then you say, well, now we're going to talk about the internal rules of Congress, the processes by which the two chambers govern themselves and run their business. Most undergraduates, and probably a few graduate students, their eyes just don't light up. But as it turns out, by the way, that there are really critical issues with respect to the rules. The two Congresses, again, as we've seen from the beginning of this course, have to do with the representative and legislative function that both chambers perform, although to some degree differently. But you could obviously, since Congress is a bicameral institution, it's also clear that two Congresses can also describe literally these two very different chambers. And there are profound issues about how these two bodies relate to each other and how they both give a view of American politics. And so the question of rules, it turns out that the Senate and the House have quite different rules. And if you're looking ahead in the schedule, by the way, in the week of the 19th and 21st, this coming week we'll be discussing chapters 8 and 9. And then, by the way, let me both continue this subject that I'm talking about, which is the internal rules of each chamber, and then kind of move on to the next thing, which is Baker's very fine book. It's now the 4th edition of this book. An intense comparison of the House and Senate and how they operate differently, both not with only respect with internal legislative business and their structures and committees and their rules and that kind of stuff, but also the Baker book also talks about relations with special interests and the representational environment outside of Congress too. So, but again, we'll start with the internal structures, parties and committees, procedures, and by the way, Chapter 8 literally is about the rules. Chapter 9 is a little more amorphous. It's about decision-making in Congress, and it's not quite as descriptive of existing structures and procedures as chapters 6, 7, and 8 are. But in a way, what Chapter 9 tries to describe is, and this is kind of where the book is more political science-y, not just reporting on things that can be described, but the way that the discipline actually analyzes the behavior of these human beings as an empirical discipline. And some rather interesting stuff in those chapters, as you'll see. And that's for this coming week. And then also this week, the weekend of the 12th to the 15th, or the 16th, we'll also then start the Baker book, as I just mentioned. And so we'll continue that through the end of this week, and then next week, there was an intense comparison between the two chambers. And the differences between the two chambers have really come to the fore ever since the rather intense national politics that we've been involved in for the last several years and continue to be involved in. As we'll see, some of the controversies facing the nation today actually highlight these rather remarkable differences. And of course, the week after that, the 26th to the 28th, we'll turn to the Ehrenberg and Dove book and the very hotly contested question of the Senate filibuster, because there's no question that you'll see that both in terms of the chapter 6, 7, 8, 9 of Davidson and Olezik, and then the Baker book, as I said a minute ago, the two Congresses with respect to the two bicameral institutions of House and Senate, they really are quite different institutions. They're housed in the same building, but they have quite separate lives and quite separate ways of processing the national good. And we'll see, by the way, I've already talked about this briefly in the first chapter, Baker, at the beginning of the course. We'll come back to these two terms, which are really quite essential to Baker's analysis of the differences between House and Senate, which is these interesting terms that you might remember. There was a couple of PRQs on them, of adversarial versus unitary democracy. And that will focus on, again, as I said a minute ago, the highly contested issue of the Senate filibuster. Now, there's been a lot of nonsense and a lot of misinformation, disinformation on both sides of the partisan divide about the filibuster. And so the Aronson and Dove book, both of these people were, I think Dove was the parliamentarian, and Aronson was, one of them was actually the Senate parliamentarian for many years. And so Ehrenberg, obviously, from their title, they don't hide their intentions, defending the filibuster. They think the filibuster is a good thing. And Ehrenberg, just recently, a couple of weeks ago, had an editorial in the Wall Street Journal, which I sent out to you. And I've been sending you editorials and other articles from different newspapers on different sides, on both sides of this question. And so the usefulness of the Ehrenberg book and Dove book is its informational quality. It will actually explain the background of the filibuster, and also I'll provide some of that too. As you're going to see, I've never been in Congress, thank God for the nation, or thank God for that, for the nation, I should say. Although when I moved to Spartanburg, the chairman of the Spartanburg Republican Party asked me once, approached and said, was interested if I would be interested in running for Congress, and of course that was in the 80s, and I have to say, because I'm active in Republican politics, and when I first came, before I moved to Charlotte, I spoke at many different places, and I can just imagine that that was the time, by the way, in the 80s and 90s, when if you weren't born in the South, you might as well have come from a different planet. And many people have thought that I come from a different planet anyway, and who knows. So, of course, my point is I've never been in Congress, studied it a good portion of my life, but one of the things I have done, and you'll see this will contribute to my discussion of the filibuster and other aspects of legislative rules, is I was a member of the faculty senate in several institutions and several organizations. I was a parliamentarian. And that means I have a pretty thorough notion, a pretty thorough understanding of Robert's Rules of Parliamentary Procedure. And that will help, as I'm going to try to argue, and help in the task that Dove and Ehrenberg do in terms of informing you about the history of the filibuster and its developing. As you'll also see, and this is what I'm going to contribute from my own understanding and experience, is the filibuster isn't just rooted in the history of the Senate and American politics, again, about which there's been a good deal of disinformation on both sides of the aisle. It's also rooted in parliamentary procedure. So just to whet your appetite on that, you're going to discover that the principle, or I should say the procedure in parliamentary procedure, and maybe some of you have actually been a member of an organization that used parliamentary procedure, such as many organizations do, by the way. The procedure that the filibuster and closure, which is an associated procedure with it, is developed out of parliamentary procedure, is called calling the previous question. And so when we turn to the filibuster, and explicitly this very hot topic, obviously for partisan reasons, in contemporary politics, will then come to the question of whether the filibuster is a good thing, a bad thing, what justifies it, whether it needs to be reformed or even eliminated. Now, for the rest of the course, by the way, starting with the first week in May, at this point I'm still planning to do chapters 10 and 11 of Davidson and Olzik, which then turn to the other primary external environment of Congress, and that is the executive branch, meaning primarily the presidency and the political conduct of the executive branch and the bureaucracy. And then the rest of the course, as I explained from the beginning of the semester, will concern ourselves with the question of how well Congress works or not, given our original observation that Americans generally think that Congress is a poorly functioning institution. So that is our plan for the next couple of weeks, really the next month or so, and so let's turn to chapter 6 and 7 of Davidson and Olzik, the party structure, the parties of Congress and their structure and operation, and the committees and staff. As I frequently do when I teach Congress in my American government class, I point out that these three structures of Congress, parties, committees, and staff, are all, there are, I suppose, two terms you could use: extra-constitutional, post-constitutional. They are not part of the original design of the Constitution of the framers. they developed subsequently afterwards. And so in each of these institutions, we'll talk about how they did originate and develop over time. And by the way, as when I teach the stuff in American government, I will often point out that with all of these internal structures, post-constitutional or extra-constitutional, in the sense that, again, they developed historically after the founding, and you'll see that each. What's interesting about all of them is almost all observers would say they are now essential to the present-day operation of Congress, and that Congress could not and would not work as an institution were it not for these three supporting structures. And I happen to agree with that, and you'll see there are also some differences. Whereas parties developed outside of Congress and then became critical aspects of the internal operation of Congress, committees and staff developed completely with respect to internal needs within the institution. So all three of them, again, are extra-constitutional. All three of them are probably essential to Congress's functions and decisively shape its legislative performance, the performance of its legislative functions. But you'll see there are obvious differences between them too.